In this lecture, we will be examining the rise of the American Populist Movement. This political phenomenon resulted in the emergence of a formal populist party, sometimes called, as you can see in the image here, the People's Party, which threatened to break the grip on power held by the Republican and Democratic parties in the 1890s. An important component in the rise of the populist movement was the gradual emergence of an American agricultural crisis in the decades after the Civil War. Farmers had experienced strong years during the Civil War. However, the post-war drop in demand for products began to cause falling agricultural prices. Also, shortages of currency, especially in the western states, led to a shortage of credit for farmers who then could not purchase necessary supplies and the farm implements. In addition, there was a rise in competition from agricultural producers in such nations as Russia, Canada, Australia, and Argentina. And this increase in the global supply of grain and livestock caused global agricultural prices to fall. Finally, American farmers also fared poorly in a series of recessions and banking panics in the last 3 decades of the 19th century. The numerous difficulties in American agriculture led to a surge in radicalism among American farmers. This first took the form of the Grange movement of the 1870s, that's Grange. And this focused on cooperative action by farmers to further their economic self-interest. The Grange movement also focused on reducing the power of railroads, which many farmers believed unfairly gouged them on the cost of shipping agricultural products. The Grange movement began to be replaced in the late 1870s by what was known as the Alliance movement. This movement was much more radical than the Grange movement, and it advocated more emphasis on political reform to help farmers. The first significant alliance organization was known as the Knights of Reliance, which was formed in Texas in 1877. The alliance movement quickly spread, and in a few short years also made significant inroads into cotton-producing states. Initially, the alliances advocated cooperation between farmers and those with whom they did business. Agricultural co-ops purchased supplies in bulk and then sold these to farmers at prices lower than many merchants. However, one aspect of the struggle of farmers remained unchanged. Farmers had great difficulty obtaining financing to collectively market their crops. Many American farmers started to distrust the American financial system, which they saw as exploitative and contrary to the well-being of farmers. Many agricultural producers in the United States turned into political, economic, and social radicals as a result. Farmers from different parts of the country disagreed on solutions and methods to rectify their situation. Most farmers thought that crop prices were far too low, that transportation costs were far too high, and that the American financial system had failed them. Nearly all American farmers demanded political solutions to their problems, but regional sectionalism prevented Northern, Western, and Southern alliances from joining forces in a truly unified national alliance of agricultural producers. Prior to 1890, a number of farm groups became involved in local and state elections, but generally they remained aligned with one of the two major parties. However, farmers' alliance groups arrived on the American political landscape in the elections of 1890 with significant influence. The state legislatures and governorships in a number of southern states were claimed by alliance-sponsored candidates, and the farmers' alliance groups also posted impressive victories in state races in Kansas, Minnesota, Nebraska, and South Dakota. The unwillingness of Republicans and Democrats to address the concerns of farmers led farmers' alliance groups to form a third political party. The Populist Party, sometimes known as the People's Party, ended the sectional divide in its efforts to unite Western and Southern farmers. The 1892 cartoon depicted here illustrates the sort of a patchwork quality of the Populist Party, in that the party tried to appeal to a wide range of American voters with different and often competing and conflicting political interest. The Populist Party held its first major convention in St. Louis in 1892, and in the 1892 presidential election, the Populists nominated General James Weaver of Iowa as presidential candidate. The Populist platform called for a graduated income tax, as well as national ownership of railroads and telephone and telegraph systems. The Populists called for government-subsidized loans that used crops as collateral for farmers. In addition, the Populists wanted unlimited coinage of silver and efforts to dramatically increase the money supply to ease the credit crunch faced by farmers. Populists demanded the election of senators by popular vote, predating the later amendment. And to attract union members, Populists also called for an 8-hour workday and demanded a ban on so-called undesirable immigration, in particular Chinese and Southern European immigrants. The bank panic of 1893 led to a worldwide depression. The panic began after an earlier collapse of a British bank known as the Baring Brothers, B-A-R-I-N-G. This bank had made some poor investments in Argentina, and the collapse led to a cascading series of bank failures around the globe. As a result of the panic and the subsequent depression, millions of Americans found themselves out of work in short order, joining the ranks of the unemployed in the winter of 1893 and 1894. We should note this was an era before the emergence of what we would today call social safety nets, such as unemployment insurance and government programs to aid the poor. And for most unemployed workers at this time, losing a job was especially catastrophic. President Grover Cleveland believed the depression was caused in part by an overabundance of silver currency, and he pushed for the repeal of laws requiring the government to purchase silver ore from Western mining concerns. This anti-silver policy split the Democratic Party and improved the fortunes of the Populists. The image on this slide is from an 1896 Broadway play entitled The War of Wealth, which was based loosely on events that occurred during the Panic of 1893. The depression that occurred after the Panic of 1893 is noteworthy for the so-called armies of unemployed workers who marched on the nation's capital, pleading for relief. The most famous of these groups was led by Jacob Coxey, a man who owned a sand quarry here in Ohio. Coxey called for a march of 100,000 unemployed men, but in the end, only about 500 actually made it to Washington, D.C. Among the demands, Coxey insisted that the federal government develop programs of public works to put the unemployed to work on projects. And it's interesting, this was rather similar to federal programs in the Great Depression of the 1930s that FDR enacted. Coxey also called for the federal government to provide money to communities to fund work building roads, and a move that was rather similar to plans put forth by FDR in the 1930s. Jacob Coxey and other leaders were arrested, and his followers were chased away by police. At the same time, the federal government used U.S. troops to break up the 1894 Pullman Railroad strike that disrupted the nation's railroad system. Labor leader Eugene V. Debs, pictured here on this slide, was denied his constitutional rights of habeas corpus in a trial. The government claimed that the rail strike disrupted U.S. mail delivery, thus making it a national concern, and then, by extension, Debs was not entitled to normal constitutional protections in a trial. He spent several years in a federal prison for leading labor strikes. These incidents and many others, however, led quite a few Americans to question whether the government really had the interests of average citizens in mind, and this furthered the populist cause. In the run-up to the 1896 election, populists called again for the unlimited coinage of silver to increase the money supply and improve access to credit, especially for farmers. The Democratic Party sided with the silver cause, while the Republicans backed gold coinage and, by extension, tighter money supplies. William Jennings Bryan was nominated by both the Populists and the Democrats, and in his famous Cross of Gold speech, which you can access from the weekly schedule on the course website for this particular week, he attacked the gold standard, denouncing supporters of gold and insisting that they shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. At age 36, William Jennings Bryan was and still is the youngest nominee for president by a major party. The Republican Party in the election nominated William McKinley, a congressman from Ohio. He's pictured on the left on this slide. The election featured some unusual defections from expected voting patterns, in large measure due to the influence of the Populist Party. For example, Republicans in states noted for silver mining gave a significant amount of support to William Jennings Bryan, the populist and Democrat candidate. Democratic newspaper editors provided significant support to McKinley. For example, Bryan traveled widely across the United States, and he delivered more than 600 speeches in this campaign. McKinley's campaign, by contrast, was organized by Ohio financial magnate Marcus Hanna, and this was the first modern presidential political campaign that emphasized gaining a huge campaign funding edge as a way to win the presidency. Instead of traveling the country, McKinley focused on advertising and paid political staffers to travel around the country and build support. McKinley's margin of victory was 271 to 176 in the Electoral College, though the results were much closer in the popular vote, with McKinley ending up with only 51% of the popular vote. The gold versus silver debate gradually faded after there were additional gold discoveries at the end of the century, and the issue became somewhat obscure once currency and precious metals were later delinked and the money supply loosened up somewhat. The 1896 election also marks the point at which the populist movement began to fade. Populists either joined one of the two major parties or joined forces with Eugene V. Debs and the sort of resurgent Socialist Party, which emerged as an influential force in American politics as the 20th century opened. And this draws to a close our brief examination of the populist movement in the United States in the late 19th century.